Last month, I made an episode about dynamic paint and had an awesome idea for a project that we could do on CGC Weekly. Today, we're doing that project. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of CGC Weekly here on the CG Cookie Blender Training YouTube channel. In last month's episode about dynamic paint, I thought up the idea of creating a rain puddle that actually reacts to particulate rain. So we'll have rain particles falling down, and every time a rain particle hits the surface of that puddle, it splashes and creates a ripple like actual rain would. If you haven't already watched the video on dynamic paint, I'd recommend going ahead and watching that first. That way when we get into things, you aren't falling behind or confused as to what we're doing. There will be a link right up here, I think. That's where cards go. Regardless, let's go ahead and get started on this project. Alright, so for once on this episode, this isn't actually the default Blender startup file. This is a custom file that I put together specifically for this project, and you guys can download it down in the description if you'd like to follow along. So if we look at our scene here, we can see it's pretty basic. We have one wall here, and a ground plane. Well, technically the walls are the same object, but yeah, you get the general idea. So if we press Shift Z here to go into rendered mode, you can see that after it loads a second here, that we just have this nice graffiti wall set up in just an HDRI environment from HDRI Haven. So it's pretty basic. One thing that I would like to note is that this ground plane down here does have micro displacement enabled, right? So if for whatever reason, when you shift into render mode, or if you try and render a frame and it's not rendering, it's saying that there's some sort of CUDA error or OpenCL error, or you're out of VRAM or something, come into with the ground plane selected, come into the modifiers tab here and change the dicing scale up a little bit, maybe something like 6 or 12, and this will lower the polygon count in your final render, which will make it a lot easier for your computer to render. But by default, I have it set to 3 because 3 is just enough to give us good detail combined with good results. Regardless, let's go ahead and get started and add our puddle. So our puddle is basically just going to be a plane, which seems a little bit weird, but when we scale our plane up and position it over our hole here and move it just down a little bit, you can see what I'm talking about. Our plane starts to form, or our puddle starts to form right here, and if we scale the plane up a little bit more, you can see we get that whole part of the puddle there. So now we have this very obvious puddle forming in the middle of our geometry here, which is exactly what we're looking for. I am going to go into edit mode and kind of shrink up the puddle a little bit, just because I don't want it to be too huge. The idea is that it should just barely go beyond the limits of our project here. That way we aren't wasting extra time calculating things that we aren't even going to see. So before we go any further, let's first talk about what we're planning on doing with this plane that's in the ground. I figured the best way to replicate, waves would probably be using the waves type in the dynamic paint settings. And as we learned from the last video, using the waves type uses vertex displacement, right? So it creates actual warps to the geometry. And that means we need a high poly count. But right now, our plane is just one big face. It is just, yeah, one big face. So we need to split this up a few different times. So I'm just going to do this with a subdivision surface modifier. I'm just going to add that. I'm going to change it from Catmull Clark to simple. That way we don't get any extra smoothing. I'm going to max out the levels all the way to 6. And then we're going to click apply. Now before we go any further, I'm going to add another subdivision surface modifier. I'm going to change it to simple as well, but we're not going to apply this one. We're going to leave the levels at 1. And this is going to be kind of our go-to tweak as we go amount of subdivisions in case we need to change things up. Additionally, I'm going to change the shading of our ground plane here to smooth. That way it looks a little bit better when the ripples come out and we don't have a bunch of like polygonal jagged ripples occurring. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and go into camera view and press Shift Z to see if our puddle appears. But you'll notice it doesn't. It's completely non-existent. And that's because if we leave the camera view here, you'll notice that the ground plane, or our puddle plane down here, is actually below the ground plane. And that's because we're using micro displacement. So the ground plane got displaced upward quite a bit. So in order to fix that, we need to move our ground plane up. Or sorry, not our ground plane up. We need to move our rain puddle plane up. There are too many planes in this. Way too many. There we go. Go down a little bit more. Right there. Oh, I'm so close to hitting the sweet spot. There we go. Right there is kind of the sweet spot with this puddle. Maybe a little bit higher. There we go. Perfect. So here you can see that our puddle is now visible when we enter camera view, and it's just a big white plane, like you'd expect. So we're ready to start working on our actual dynamic paint simulation. So now that we have this all subdivisioned and stuff like that, we can come into the physics tab over here, select dynamic paint off our list, make sure we have canvas selected because this is going to be the thing rippling, the thing receiving the dynamic paint, and we'll click add canvas. Then we just need to change the surface type to waves, and we're done with that for now. We'll be coming back to it later, but for now that's all we need to do. Next, we need to add another plane. And this plane is going to be used for our rain particle emission. So I'm going to move this upwards quite a bit, so it's kind of at the top of our box here. Let's scale it up nice and large and make sure it covers the entire area. That way we get rain falling everywhere and not just in a small, tiny area. Just like that. That looks pretty dang good. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and add a particle system to this plane. So just by adding a new particle system, if we go to frame 0 and click play, voila, there are particles falling. Mind blown. Not really. I am, however, going to change the number of particles emitted down to 100. We're going to leave pretty much everything else the same, but we are going to come down to the render tab here and uncheck the box that says emitter. That way when we go into rendered mode, we aren't seeing this ground plane casting any shadows or anything on our geometry and stuff down below. Perfect. So on to the next step, making the two of these interact. In order to do that, we need to add the emitter plane up top as a dynamic paint object. So we'll add a dynamic paint modifier, and this time we're going to change it to brush. We're going to click add brush, and for our paint source, we're going to change it from mesh volume to particle system. This will basically allow the dynamic paint to utilize the individual particles being emitted by our emission plane as dynamic paint brushes. We'll change the paint source to the particle system that we created, and now if we click play, you'll notice that as our particles strike our plane down here, they create ripples, and that is really awesome to see. Now, I actually think I'm just going to straight up get rid of this subdivision surface modifier because, yeah, look at that. That looks pretty good as is. So we don't need the extra subdivision surface modifier. All that does is make things laggy. If you are working on larger puddles or a closer render, you might want to enable it, but that's ultimately up to your judgment. Perfect. So one thing I'm noticing with this is that these droplets are really causing big ripples. It looks something more like small pebbles are being dropped in instead of droplets of water. So in order to fix this, we'll come into our dynamic paint settings in our physics tab up here, and we'll change some of the settings up here. So the first thing I want to change is the influence scale. And influence is how much the stuff actually gets displaced. So you'll notice with the influence scale set to 1, these were dropping up a lot higher, but since we set the influence scale to 0.5, they're not bouncing up nearly as much as they did before. Perfect. Next, I'm going to change the dampening up to 0.1. Or actually, sorry, it's just called damping, which is kind of weird. I feel like it should be called dampening. But anyway, damping basically takes care of a few different things regarding how fast it returns to its normal and whether or not it does return to its normal. But in this case, we're using damping to restrict the radius that our droplets have. So if I set the damping to like 0.8 or something here, see how the particles legit just go in and then they just kind of fill over with themselves, right? Setting this to 0.1 basically allows those particles to have a little bit of damping, but not too much, and it restricts the radius a little bit. Additionally, we're also going to drop the spring down to 0.1, and this will just mean that the particles will return back to the height of the wave will return back to its normal height a little bit slower. Last thing I'm going to do here is if we look at these waves, they're kind of traveling slow, and when you see a small particle hit like a puddle, the waves move pretty fast, the rings move pretty fast. So we're going to change the speed up to somewhere around 2. Actually, 2 might be a little bit too fast. We'll change it to 1.5. There we go. So now these droplets are hitting, and they're creating ripples, which is exactly what we're looking for. So the last main thing we need to do here is to give these particles some sort of object, because right now they're just particles. They have no visual representation. We're not going to see them in the final render. So in order to accommodate for this, I'm just going to add an icosphere. And right now you can see that my icosphere is relatively high poly. I want to drop it all the way down to the lowest poly setting that it can be. So I press T to open up the side menu, and down in this bottom menu, if you for some reason don't see this bottom menu, just come down here and click this little plus button and it'll pop up. We'll change the subdivisions down to 1, just like that, and you can see our icosphere is much more low poly. We'll move this down a little bit so we can see it better. And we're going to kind of hide this below our ground plane. We can move it to a different layer if we wanted to, but I'm just going to leave it here because it's really not affecting much anyway. So next, I'm going to set its shading to smooth, just so we can have those smooth settings, because this is going to be our droplet. And we're going to come up to our particle emitter, go into our particle settings, and under the render tab, we're going to select object, and then select our icosphere. And now you can see that each particle, if I pause this here, each particle is a representation of that same icosphere that's down below. Now these rain droplets are a little bit too big for my liking, so I'm going to change the scale down just a little bit. Something around there maybe? Maybe 0.025 would be a good idea. And if you'd like, you can also change the random scale, which will make all the particles slightly different sizes. But you know, honestly, I think this is pretty good, so I'm just going to work with this. So I'm going to switch into camera view. And you can see up close here that as these rain droplets fall, they hit the water and they create splashes, which is really cool. And it gives you a really cool effect that you wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve with methods that involve faking it, like, you know, animated texture maps. So last thing we need to do here is add some materials both for our actual water and also for our rain droplets, because our rain droplets are kind of, you know, very white. And unfortunately, they're both water, so we can just use one material for the two of them. So I'm going to come into the materials tab here. I'm going to click new material. I'm just going to name it water. I guess I already have a water material in the scene from a previous attempt that I failed at, but I'll make sure those are gone when I upload it. But yeah, just call it water, and then set the surface just to the principled BSDF shader. And then all we need to do here is change the transmission value up to 1 and the IOR to 1.333, because that is the IOR of water. Additionally, if your roughness is set to anything, I just set it to like 0.01. That way it has some very slight roughness, but not a lot. All right, so one other thing we need to do before moving too far here is, you'll notice, is we need to come into our render settings here, scroll down to our light paths, and if it's not already enabled, by default it is enabled, we need to enable reflective and refractive caustics, because without these, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but you can see that, especially with refractive caustics, you watch in this dark portion here, as soon as I enable refractive caustics, our scene gains a lot more light, and that's because a lot more light is able to pass through and reflect back accurately. But I'm going to turn on both reflective and refractive caustics, just so we get that extra light below our puddle to make things seem a little bit more realistic. Last thing I'm going to do before I'm going to call this okay to render is check this little motion blur box, that's a tongue twister, and set the shutter to about 0.5. Motion blur will allow us to actually see these particles as they would appear in real life. Because when you see rain in drawings and when you see rain in real life, it appears as though it's like a single streak. And that's because it's traveling so fast that it causes motion blur. But right here you can see the viewport never has motion blur enabled, so we just kind of have this rain droplet that's just a single droplet. Doesn't seem accurate at all. But when we have this motion blur on, if I were to render this, and keep in mind this rain droplet doesn't have proper materials on it, but if I render just this tiny little portion here, it'll take a second to load because we have to tessellate the displacement of our ground plane here. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. And there you go. We don't even need to render this entire scene. You can see right here that our particle is very clearly streaked, just like a water droplet would be. So let's go ahead and, before we do anything else here, come down to our icosphere and apply the water material here as well. I guess it's water 001 in my case. But now you can see that if we press Shift Z, our water droplet, if it loads, will now have that transmission enabled. So that's exactly what we're looking for, and I'd say we'll go for a render. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and render out this animation. It's only 250 frames, so it's gonna be kind of short, but what you're seeing right now is the final result from this exact tutorial. Anyway, I hope you guys found that interesting. I certainly think it's cool how the awesome results that you can get from this. It's not something I would have typically expected to see, but it's really cool. And the results definitely look more realistic than any other option would provide. But yeah, that's about all I've got for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Keep it real. Really quick, put your mouse cursor right on top of my hand, all right? Follow it, follow it, follow it, right here. Okay, now click, and then click the subscribe button. Oh, and while you're at it, head over to cgcookie.com and hook yourself up with a subscription for tons of awesome Blender content that will make you a Blender master in no time.